Hi, everybody. I'd just like to introduce my guest for this afternoon, which is Roger. He's a chartered engineer with over 30 years' experience in design and commissioning of electrical power systems around the globe. He doesn't claim to be a climatologist, but he's asking questions which are not answered by IPC publications or predictions. Here, he wants to address three questions. One, can net zero be justified? Two, how has the policy affected us so far? And three, is net zero achievable? So that's the key core of our vodcast this afternoon. So Roger, over to you. I'd like to introduce yourself and please just fire away and tell us when you want to move on. Yeah, okay. Do you think net zero is... Sorry, go on.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to introduce myself there. As Mike just said, I'm a chartered engineer, electrical designing and I've got some questions which anybody should be able to ask, and anybody with some knowledge, basic knowledge, numerical skills, and knowledge of the laws of physics should be able to ask and answer. You don't have to be a climatologist to do that. No one denies that climate has changed, it's been changing for millennia, but some believe that the impact of mankind on global temperature is negligible. Indeed, the accuracy of the so-called IPCC science, settled science, and whether it is settled or not, to question the accuracy of those predictions, to review the impact of net zero to date, and whether we can pursue it. So, as Mike said, there are three questions. If I start with the first one, which is, do you think net zero is justified and is it viable? Well, this is about how much CO2 stops the Earth from cooling off at night via the greenhouse effect. And by transfer of thermal radiation to the outer atmosphere, where it can radiate back out into space. And how much, most importantly, how much man affects that process. Of course, the climate has changed, as I said earlier, for many millennia, long before man appeared on the planet. But there is no validated model to show conclusively how much human CO2 emissions affect global temperature. The first thing to recognize is that CO2 comprises about 0.04%, 4.4%, 0.04%. That's 400 parts per million of the atmosphere. To put it another way, the volume of the atmosphere is 600 times that of CO2. And because CO2, CHG impacts only over a narrow part of the spectrum, and it is only a trace gas, increases above 300 ppm are not linear. These increases are not linear, as demonstrated by Professor Happer of Princeton University. Indeed, around 150 ppm, which is not a lot lower than it was, a century ago, around 150 ppm, vegetation dies. But no one says an optimum level. In the past, levels have been more than 20 times the current value of 420. So you would think at some point somebody might say, here, if we reduce the CO2 levels, we could actually end the life of vegetation on the planet. Is there not a risk of that? Should we not be very careful before we reduce CO2 levels? The IPCC can continue to postulate about worst case scenarios. And we saw that Dr. Ferguson, or was he Professor Ferguson, who came up with a model which was based on worst case scenarios and concluded that 500,000 people were going to die, when it's quite clear that he didn't take account of the collateral impact of lockdown, and his calculations were not based on realistic, levels of impact it's quite clear that following the science is not always wise if nobody's allowing us to question the science. Continue to postulate with their models until they can produce one which can be validated against. We should not be returning to a pre-industrial age, driving many into poverty until we get confidence in those. Sadly, their predictions take no account of the greater GHP impact, the global warming effect of atmosphere moisture, or that the sun drives global temperature, which I'll come on to later. Natural CO2 emissions follow temperature, and they also follow temperature, which also follows solar and planetary cycles. So how accurate are those models? Well, let's see, as seen in this first slide, between 1977 and 2020, average global temperature rose 0.3 degrees C, compared with predictions of 0.9 degrees C by the IPCC models. And they miss out periods of relative cooling. And climatologists, David Dilley and others, predict that due to long-term solar and planetary cycles, we're approaching the start of a cooling period, and the polar temperature will fall in the coming years. That's supported by the next slide. And if you can bring up the next slide. On that slide represents solar intensity in watts per square meter over the years from 1978 to 2023. But the gradient of the IPCC projections, as we saw earlier, is on a constantly upward trend in solar cycles. It also seems that solar emissions into the atmosphere from volcanic activity and the exhaust from seagoing tankers has been lower over the last few years than before, which means that solar radiation reaching the Earth is higher. So we must question how much of the above is factored into IPCC models. Indeed, it seems that the mass of polar ice caps has not reduced by anything like the extent predicted by Al Gore and John Kerry, and the solar cycle trends would tend to suggest that, if anything, the ice caps are not likely to thin much more over the next few years. So if you look at those, it's quite interesting actually looking at the slide that's up at the moment. You might notice, for example, that there's a dip in the solar intensity around about 2009, 2010. Now, if you remember the winter of those years, it was quite severe. In fact, now we have a new peak, which would tend to explain the higher temperatures that we've seen this summer. To commit enormous sums, again, problems which can't be validated, driving millions into fuel poverty. I can actually summarize a number of areas where the IPCC models have not explained what has happened in the real world. In 2013, fossil fuel emissions accelerated, but the rate of rise in atmospheric concentration did not. Hydrocarbon use accelerated between 1970 and 1990, but the Arctic air temperature radiation had more impact on that temperature than did hydrocarbon emissions. Looking further back, human emissions fell during the Great Recession, 0.2 gigatons in 1929 to 0.9 gigatons in 1932. Global temperature increased. The Great Drought of 1540, which I guess many people don't know about, led to the loss of 500,000 lives. And in those days, there weren't many more than 1 million or 2 people. And that was when CO2 levels were much lower. If you look at the next slide,
Okay.
You can see what happens when that solar cycle drops, can happen when that solar cycle, I mentioned 2009, 2010, but this is going back even further to 1700, at a time when the solar cycle was at a minimum. So more recently, CO2 levels increased by 2.5 ppm in 2020 after human emissions had fallen during lockdown. I'll repeat that. More recently, levels increased by 2.5 ppm in 2020 after human emissions had fallen. Now, if the levels didn't go up, if levels didn't go down to follow the human emissions have an insignificant impact on CO2 levels.
Sorry, next slide.
Yes.
Can I just stop you there for a minute, Roger? I mean, it's interesting. IPCC, they apparently have a lot of. They say it's peer reviewed, but as I understand it, a lot of the stuff that they produce are not peer reviewed and not validated. Is that correct? Do you know?
Yeah, that's my understanding. I don't know the detail, but I know also lots of people who continue to ask the same questions as I'm asking. So they're not. It depends who you get to do the peer review. If you get somebody to do a peer review that's also in the pay or dependent on funding, from the same people, then obviously they don't want to lose their funding. So what we need really is an independent peer review.
Yeah, I mean, science unfortunately tends to follows the money, and independent reviews tend to be limited, and that's in a number of fields. But it's brilliant. How long have you been researching? You say you admit you're an engineer and not a climatologist, but I don't think you have to be a climatologist to understand the issues, do you? You just need an engineering brain, as you have.
Well, you don't.
And
yeah, you have to be. You just have to be logical and asking valid questions. If I give you an example, Mike, you've got a kettle. Probably it might be a transparent one. You can see when you switched it on, as you put heat into it. Liken this to the sun putting heat into the earth and not getting back out again. As the heat builds up, it starts to bubble, doesn't it?
Yeah,
and you've got there's no way that you could produce a model to say exactly how the bubbles are going to work, how they're going to, what the configuration is going to be, any more than you can with climate. The idea of El Nino, for example, we know El Nino is part of the weather, effectively, but if you raise the temperature, we have no control over what impact that has on the configuration of the weather. We have no, whatever happens, if the temperature is building up, it's the temperature that's actually causing the change. And they will admit that. But, quite clearly, we're talking here about the heat flux. We're talking about there's nothing else. We don't control, we can't actually dictate how the weather configures itself. So that's why I say that you don't need to be a climatologist. You just need to know whether the laws of physics and whether the heat in and the heat out is we can talk about.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. So I don't want to disturb your flow here, because I think it's really important to know that, we need to be able to question and the levers of influence. We have a lot of people who claim that because they've got this and that they have the knowledge. But when you dig, I mean, I know that, is it Judith Curry, and people who have a different point of view do not get any traction in the media. And they've been doing data sets in this area for quite a while. So the important thing.
She's very, Judith Curry, valid, and I got tremendous respect for her. But I can think of others who, who as Professor, raised questions as well, and he takes the view that yes, there is an impact, but it's negligible.
Yeah,
it's really not worth looking at because it's negligible. The impact is negligible. So there are people out there who are, respected professionals who are asking. You don't expect them for them to be treated the same way as Galileo when he said the Earth went around the sun.
Yeah. No, and engineers, I have a very engineers tend to be very logical. They think in a very straightforward way, and So let me not.
So can I just talk about this slide then?
Yeah.
This is quite striking because if you look at the lower part with the sine waves, they look vaguely like sine waves. You'll see that there are 4 different years portrayed there. These are CO2. This is CO2 concentration in parts per million. So you can see that year on year, the average level has gone up. We know that it's gone up for since 1960. I think it's gone up significantly. Now, if you look at the variation, the variation is about natural emissions peaking in around May, and they drop to they swing from peaks to trough by about 6 ppm. Now, if you expected to see a change in the trend after lockdowns, they pointed, because if you look at the top half of the figure, there is a red bar. That is the fall off in human CO2. Okay, so if you try and see a connection between that and the trend, the annual trend in the CO2 in the atmosphere, you will find it very difficult to see a connection. And as I said earlier, the actual average level went up after lockdown. So, the sun, the Earth is obviously going around the sun, and the position, the axis of the Earth means that, as the seasons move, some parts, what happens is that more CO2 gets emitted from vegetation, and the sea, there's a law, I can't remember whose law it is now, but there's a law that says that the sea can only, contain so much CO2, and the amount that it can hold, it actually reduces as the temperature increases. So you can imagine how, as the sun moves around, as we see it, it will cause to be emitted from the seas. So if you go on to the next slide, you've seen this in us. Well, what we're seeing in the previous slide is that the sun is the principal driver of global temperature and hence natural CO2 emissions, which are global greening. And you can see the impact of increasing CO2. It's used all the time by greenhouses. And the average rise in CO2 levels between 1960 and 2020, the average annual rise was 1.6 ppm. So you might ask, what did the UK contribute? Well, if natural emissions account for 97% of the annual rise in CO2, and human emissions account for 3% of that rise, and the UK accounts for around 1% of those human emissions, then that equates to 0.03% of total emissions, or around 0.00048 parts per million per annum. Now, if you could move on to the next slide, you'll see that in perspective. Right. If you look bottom right hand, but first of all, the pink is 97%. 97% is the total increase from natural emission every year. The yellow is the contribution from human emissions. That's the 3%. And that little tiny dot down at the bottom right hand is the UK's emissions. Can you see how small that is? I don't know if you can make out the dot so small, but it's
no, okay. It is amazing, really.
It's down there,
yeah,
bottom right hand corner.
I'm listening to you. I'm sort of staggered.
On that
really.
basis, on that basis, it would 3,000 years for the UK to add 1.6 ppm to current levels. 1.6 ppm is the average. Thing I mentioned earlier is the average rise between 960 and 2020. So it would take us to add that much. The UK alone would take 3,000 years.
Right.
In the meantime, China emits more. In the meantime, China emits more CO2 in 11 days than the UK does in a year, as it makes more and more electric. UK is to spend over 5 trillion, that's if you include all the other costs apart from the grid, to eliminate its 0.00048 ppm of CO2. If you move on to the next slide,
there we go. China, United States.
Yeah, this is pie chart shows the relative contributions of major countries in 2014. Bearing in mind that the UK has continued raising the cost of energy in the process, while watching more and more industry moving abroad, where they will cause more emissions than before.
It's amazing. Japan and the
UK is 1%.
Right. Japan and Russia are 4 and 5%, very low.
And Russia was 5%. I don't imagine Russia is that high now, but I think China has increased. I've got another curve which I haven't got today, but and another curve that shows that China has continued to increase its emissions several times the UK's reductions, over eliminating. Basically, it completely eclipses the UK's reduction in emissions. But since the world was, but has the temperature increased? The next slide. Has the temperature actually increased? Next slide. Yep.
Next slide. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Where you can take a selective sample anytime you want on the timescale, depending on your agenda. But since the world's been around for over 4 billion years, that's not. And as seen on this slide, we've been coming out of an ice age for some time. The other thing which complicates things, of course, is that in those days we didn't have people monitoring temperature with balloons, so we have to rely on ice core temperature data. But only and more recently we've moved other forms of monitoring, like the balloons and the satellites. And we also, of course, have seen the change in the locations where temperature taken near to the ground. There might be some areas which were in the country before, which are now in the town. And we now know, of course, that temperatures in the town tend to be the odd degree higher. So there's been so many things that have confused the issue. But
can I stop you for a second there? Can I stop you for a second? Chrissy maintains that his data sets, Professor Chrissy, his data sets are from satellite, so that they're consistent, whereas all the IPC ones are all over the place. They're not consistent. As you say, they are in areas that are hot. I don't. Is that true? As you understand?
Well, I would say the satellite ones are going to be more consistent if you take it back. When the satellites first came, I think in the 1960s, when the Russian dog first went up. So, from the 1960s to now, we've probably had the ability to monitor, using satellites that would be more consistent in terms
Well, I think
of reliable ground-based.
I think that's what Professor Chrissy says in his data sets, but which people seem to argue about anyway. So back to you. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends, as I say, where you want to take the samples. If you move the next slide.
Sorry. Oh, the next slide. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. I mean, it's a bit difficult to make out the dates there, but if you took that trough, let's see if I can work out when it is. There's a trough, around about just before 2000, probably about 1995. That if you take that trough and then move on to 2020, well, you'd argue then that temperature's gone up, wouldn't you?
It's that one there, isn't it? So yeah, that trough.
Yeah. Right. So you could argue, the temperature's gone up. You don't show the rest. So it depends, which. But these cycles are so long. I think the solar cycle is about 11 years between peak and trough, or between peaks, I think. So you really got to integrate, and it's hard to believe that the IPCC models take account of all of those factors, and therefore, they are looking for a connection between CO2 levels and actual temperature, and then make adjustments if they don't meet that theory, then they presumably make adjustments. But it's no good making adjustments to a model which doesn't include all the factors like the solar cycles and the planetary cycles. It's clearly a vain attempt to find the answer that they want.
So it's what we call curve fit. Go on. Sorry.
Sorry?
We call that curve fitting. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say that if you plotted CO2 levels on that same graph, you'd find that the rise in CO2 levels it bears no direct relationship with the temperature. I think that's fairly obvious, really. But if these questions, then you're likely to be ignored or belittled, but the so-called settled science that can't be questioned, I would suggest, if you can't question the science, it's propaganda. As I said earlier, we know Galileo was cancelled when he deduced that the Earth moves around the sun.
Yeah, before we go into the next question, it's an important point. I want to ask you, science has become, in my opinion, the fallen idol, but it's not science, it's the corruption of science by money. So it seems that, and also the status quo doesn't necessarily want to accept change. So if something's promoted, which we get at the moment, climate change, I mean, it's heavily promoted at the moment everywhere, all the time. But yeah, so what you're saying is that science isn't science if it can't be questioned, and the ability to have discussion around it. That's yes, really
I don't know. I don't know if it's always been like that. I mean, if you think about the Einstein theory, you think about Darwin. Clearly, there were times, I think, when they were somebody attempted to cancel them. I mean, there were lots of people who who were offended by Darwin's theory. And in fact, Einstein first came up with his theory of relativity. There were people that rubbished that, but he wasn't sidelined to the extent that we're being sidelined
today.
Now. Other examples, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, just on that issue,
yeah, you could
Niels
see.
Bohr and Einstein could never agree for 50 years. I mean, they just totally disagreed on how they saw, quantum mechanics versus, So science always has disagreement, but it's healthy, providing.
Well, that's right. In fact, I think even now, there are debates about whether light travels by wave or by particles. There's no reason why. What we don't have. I think what Einstein called was the unification theory, and we don't have one. If people decide, okay, I can't be bothered with this anymore, I'll support one theory or the other, then we will not move on. And if you recall that during COVID, the following in science was based on a particular model, once again, on a model which was based on scenarios. That's a thing that's appeared fairly recently. It certainly appeared in the EU, in that what they call the precautionary principle. Now, the precautionary principle basically says that if something might happen, don't worry about the probability. If it might happen, you've got to do something to prevent it. Yeah, I'm sure you've noticed that. But so if you build that into a model, the worst case assumptions, then you might miss something totally. And it did. It missed. What it missed was what a chap called Scott Atlas actually had been working on for years. Is that if you have a lockdown, you get lots of collateral damage. You get collateral damage from people who commit suicide, lost their jobs, the impact on the NHS, all of the things that we know about now. That was not factored into his model. So, the fact that we weren't allowed to question.
Yeah, the Bayesian models, though, are all based on the assumption based on your primary assumptions, what goes in to create the model. But anyway, let's go on to the next question, which is important to us all. How has net zero affected us in Great Britain? Us Great Britons.
Exactly. We should be working on. I just make a general point here that if the idea is that the rest of the world, then if we do that with this, it means we trust people like China and India to do what we're doing and follow our lead. Now, if that's the case, there is a much bigger risk that we could deal with based on that trust. And that would be to decommission our nuclear weapons, because that is expensive. And if they really believe, if the environmentalists really believe that we can trust the other countries, then shouldn't we be trusting them with that policy? I don't think so. Anyway, but as far as the UK is concerned, it has taken the lead, and it's halved its CO2 emissions since 1990, largely due to the dash for gas and the premature closure of coal-fired power stations, leaving us overexposed to the vagaries of the gas market. And politicians can't blame the Bank of England for that. They did that. Now, the UK relies on gas as a result of that to generate 40% of its electricity that EU countries rely on. The UK's over-dependence on gas is a big reason why our energy prices are elevated than elsewhere. Annual consumer price in the UK soared to around 80% in 2022, around twice that of the Eurozone. Fracking is not allowed, and the amount of energy storage is pitiful. So we're on energy storage on the continent to smooth out demand. And we are needlessly shipping in gas in tankers from abroad with a much higher carbon footprint, resulting while missing out on pay jobs and revenue to the government coffers. So we are penalised for, we're basically wearing a hair shirt. Several hundred billion in subsidies finance the building of solar and wind farms. That's now supposed to be being brought to an end. With no, because the owners of those wind farms got the market gas price for the energy generated. But as the subsidies are removed, as we're being told they are, we can expect less interest from those owners, those wind farm owners. They won't be building so many as they did. The combined cycle, this is not generally known, but combined cycle gas turbine power stations are designed to operate at around 80% efficiency. But to keep them ready to pick up load at short notice when the wind speed drops, they are operated in open cycle mode, so that they're not actually generating the waste heat gas used to operate steam turbines. Otherwise, they would have been operating at 80% efficiency. So we're burning more gas than we would have done before. Around 2 years ago, there were 3 million UK households in fuel poverty. Now there are apparently 15 million. The excessive rise in energy costs has also driven industries and jobs abroad, where they will cause higher CO2 emissions than before. So the wanton and premature decommissioning, if not vandalism, of coal-fired power stations and failure to build energy storage or nuclear power stations has contributed to this dire situation. And we must now, before long, expect power rationing, if not power cuts. We will no doubt rely on cross-channel links as much as we can, but their capacity is limited. Some propose that we should also cut back further on our oil and gas production, thereby from abroad, in many cases from countries whose emissions are rising, and it makes little sense. In the event, the penalisation of fossil fuels before alternatives were available was the height of stupidity. So
well,
that's the second question.
Right, that says it all. A couple of questions. I mean, I found it interesting. I was in South Africa and all the wagons were taking coal to China. I mean, the roads are just blocked. Not only China, but also they've recommissioned all the coal-fired power stations in France. So they were having all this coal going to France. I think it's incredible. What do you think was behind the politicians' thinking to make us dependent? I mean, it seems in many ways we are dependent on foreign companies, not only for energy supply, but for, we're a net importer of most things, and yet we're a highly creative nation. I just find it a bit like you. I find listening to you, it's incredible, really. What's your view on why this took place?
Well, there is a theory which people suggest is conspiracy theory. Now, there is no doubt that this is being orchestrated. The only thing is we don't know who has orchestrated it, but there are also a certain amount of it's down to pure stupidity. Now, whether 80% of it is down to stupidity, 20% to accuracy, or the other way around, it doesn't make any difference.
I'm a cynic. I don't think conspiracy or stupidity. I think it's money. People made money.
Well, yes, corrupt. Corruption.
Go on. Sorry.
Well, I agree, but I don't want to really introduce. I'm trying not to mix sack with, but my theory is that the global corporatists, billionaires, are in the process of transferring even more wealth to themselves, and China is obviously complicit in that because it wants control of everything that moves. And it is gradually moving in that direction to the point where they will be supplying, much more to us while they emit more CO2. and jobs and industry. So they are strengthening their position on the world stage. But the strange thing is that being in cahoots, apparently in cahoots, if it is a conspiracy, then they're in cahoots with the globalists who, in theory, you would think were more likely to be capitalists than Marxists. So this looks like an unholy alliance. Now, the question is, what do they think is going to happen once they've basically destroyed the middle income earners in the West? What do they think is going to happen? Do they not think that the Marxists might come for them?
I tend to think of it in terms of England, really, and our island. And it was a transfer of wealth to individuals by creating this over the last, the unholy, the privatization of our assets means that there was a transfer of wealth somewhere to foreign stakeholders. Don't think it's conspiracy. It's just about money.
Well, yes, money. Well, actually, if you want to achieve something and you believe in, locking people into it, you can corrupt them. You can fund them. We've seen examples of that where it's okay. Apparently, we saw an MP. I won't mention his name. He said he'd bailed out another MP to the tune of over £100,000. He had some kind of debt, and he told his PA to tell that MP, I own him now. Now, if that is acceptable, then it's not difficult, is it? If you were a big player on the international scene, you got people like that in there, would it, to get them to do what you want?
Anyway, I'll get on to the final question as time's moving on.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, I must emphasise that's all opinion. I mean, it's just my opinion. I've got no no concrete proof of that.
Right. No, I understand that. I mean, I only have one. One view is that usually follow the money, and the human ego usually wants power and control somewhere down the line, and people achieve that by having more money. But it's another issue. But the real issue is net zero really achievable? Let's ask that question, the final question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as you know, Mike, you don't embark on a project until you know you've got the finances, the resources, and the materials to complete the job on time. So if you take those issues in order, National Grid, this is all uncontestable. This is not even debatable. National Grid says it will cost 3,000 billion. That's 3 trillion to decarbonise the grid by around 2035. With a green levy of £240 pounds per annum per household, 100 billion by that date, leaving a balance of 2,900 billion to find, over 2,900 billion to find. So that must be added to the cost. To that must be added to the cost of decarbonising transport, industry, and agriculture. It's quite clear that poorer people won't be able to contribute much to that, especially after they've had to fit a heat pump and throw their old boiler away, probably for about £20,000 or more. So the average, if the total cost of net zero comes to 5 billion, that will average over £200,000 per household, and that will have to come mainly from middle and higher earners through increased taxes, perhaps wealth taxes, increased IHT, pension funds, or by doubling of the national debt, more than doubling of the national debt. It will be many years economically. Now, it's just thinking about grid maximum demand and how it's going to be met. It is currently around 45 gigawatts, and it's to double, as getting on for 100 gigawatts. So millions of electric vehicle chargers and heat pumps are added, but on some winter days, if you don't remember anything else, try to remember this. On some winter days, the total output from solar and wind is less than 1. So doubling or trebling wind farms on its own will not be enough. The grid will need a massive amount of energy storage to keep the lights on when there's little summer wind, not to mention nuclear power generation, which we should have been building before. But the chances of all that being in place by 2035 is pie in the sky. We'll be lucky to see Hinkley Point running and in time to replace the retiring nuclear power stations. In fact, the government wind farm, it's not a difficult calculation, this. In fact, the total government wind farm target of 50 gigawatts will require 300 terawatt hours of energy storage. Just remember the figure 300, because the wind farms only average around 30% of rated output over the year. And that will be needed to compensate for low wind speed. Hydrogen storage has been proposed, because batteries won't hack it. I could go into that, but I don't think we want to at the moment. Hydrogen storage has been proposed for that purpose, bearing in mind that over 2 units of energy has to be input to an electrolyzer for every unit of hydrogen energy out. But sadly, the government plans for only 10 gigawatts of H2 production, equating to 88 terawatt hours, assuming 100% utilization. And that might not even be enough for the needs of transport and industry. So we're looking at a shortage of, of getting on for 300 terawatt hours of energy storage, and the government's only planning for 88. The lack of skilled resources is already evident from delays in getting new facilities, including remote green projects, connected to the grid. It will be a long time before electric vehicles are suitable for anything other than local commuting. You can fill an ICE car for a 600-mile trip, paying at the pump in around 3 minutes. At 4 miles per kilowatt hour, a 1,000-mile nominal range requires 250 kilowatts. That's 2.5 hours at 100 kilowatts. Nobody wants to wait around for that. So let's just assume we can reduce that by a factor of 10. That means a quarter of an hour, but that would require not 100 kilowatts, but 1 megawatt. If the average service station has 20 petrol/diesel pumps, and it takes 5 times as long to charge an electric vehicle for 600 miles as it does to fill an ICE car, then 100 of those charges will be needed. Maximum demand for the service station would be around about 100 megawatts. That's enough for a town of 100,000 people. You can imagine the size of the substation. And, it's not just one. We're talking about maybe 200. Imagine 200 or 300 such service stations on this strategic road network. But perhaps the most challenging demand is for the lithium used to make batteries, including those in the electric vehicle. If each requires 40 kilograms, then around 60 million tons will be needed to make batteries for 1,500 million EVs globally. But only 130,000 tons came from lithium mines in 2022. At that rate, 400 years to make the batteries, even if hundreds more mines were to be opened. And there was enough child labour in the to excavate the material. If you bring up the next slide.
Okay.
I would like to ask Greta Thunberg about these children in the Congo and who has stolen their dreams and who has stolen their future. It says, "You have stolen my dreams and my child," she says, waiting. The cohort says, "I'm getting it as fast as I can, Greta." But many other shortages are emerging in less rare materials such as copper and steel. So I've only mentioned one. It is proposed that we stop and gas production without identifying new sources of the peripheral products which are produced as a spin-off in the refinery process, such as plastic. So we will also be obliged to import those products from abroad as well, from high-emitting countries. So in conclusion, there's clearly no justification to continue with this madness, extending the damage to our wealth, driving up numbers in fuel poverty by several million, making ourselves increasingly uncompetitive at a total cost of well over 5 trillion, or to eliminate less than 1/3,000th annual net rise in CO2 levels, as China continues to increase EV production, emitting more CO2 in 11 days than the UK does in a year. The fact is, we have neither the money, the skilled resources, nor the materials to achieve net zero by 2050, and probably not this century. And we will only in the attempt. As Lord Monckton concluded for the Science and Public Policy Institute, migration policies cheap enough to be affordable will be ineffective. But policies costly enough to be effective will be unaffordable. Spot on. But no one seems to be brave enough to tell the king he's got no clothes. Even if the drive for net zero were to be justified, it was the height of stupidity to begin the penalisation of fossil fuels before alternatives were available, including the necessary materials and resources, while increasing poverty and the risk of power cuts here, driving more industry abroad, where they will cause more CO2 emissions than before. So it doesn't sound very sensible, does
it? That's, brilliant. Listening to you, I find it incredible. So the answer you're saying, what's the solution to all of this, Roger, in your opinion? What do we need?
If we take just the two aspects I mentioned. One would be, okay, we can't get enough lithium. So what do? We look for another form of battery. It might be sodium-ion battery. Obviously you get lots of sodium from seawater. Now, the idea that could all be done and the production rate increase to that kind of level within the next 10 years is just pie in the sky. The idea that we can just resolve the problems by putting in more wind farms when the output is less than 2% of maximum demand on some days. It's not even. You'll become almost speechless because I just cannot understand why people don't grasp this. What we should be doing, I believe, if we're going to avoid power rationing, if not power cuts, is follow the grant money and only listen to those, e.g. retired scientists, who don't depend on it. Defer the 2030 phase-out of ICE vehicles and gas boilers. Stop penalising fossil fuels and exploit the UK's natural resources. Don't close gas-fired power stations, but build more. Start fracking in areas remote from villages and towns. Don't close any more serviceable coal-fired power stations. Stop building wind and solar farms. Install sufficient energy storage to stabilise the grid. Start building enough SMRs, those are small modular reactors of the Rolls-Royce type, and verify the concept, and then actually ramp up the program. Stop subsidising EV and heat pump manufacture. End net zero along with all LTNs, 15-minute cities, and everything that goes with them. But we ain't going to find. They're not going to find a politician who's got the backbone to do that.
Well, it's interesting talking to you. I think it's the statistic that stands out in my mind in just listening to you, or the figure of we need 100 gigawatts. At the moment, we're 45, but we'll need 100. And yet, wind power and everything we have at the moment is 1 gigawatt. it means
on
that
some days, on some winter days.
yeah. So the reality, I mean, it always strikes me, you can't have a policy where you don't have the technology to meet the demand. So you have to have what you're using already and go with that until there is technology to provide you with the necessary energy that you need. It's very strange.
That's exactly right. Exactly.
I mean, I don't build a building. You don't build a building thinking, well, you'll build it in this way. You always have to, I mean, I hate to say it, you start, as you know, you start with the foundations. And
Yeah.
you've got to come from the beginning up. And, I find it very strange what's happened. Why in the UK did we take up this umbrella in the 90s? I think you quoted. Who was the primary architect of this net zero in the UK? Do you know?
Well, I know when it became serious, it wasn't. It was made. It was cast into law by Mrs. May in the last few days of her premiership.
Okay.
It's the worst thing she could have done. And then, of course, it was reinforced by Boris Johnson, because Boris Johnson is not a detail man; he's a salesman. We saw a number of attempts, like the airport in the Thames Estuary, like a bridge between England and Northern Ireland. We've seen all of that, and at no point does anyone say, "Here, what's this going to cost? Can we do it? Is it feasible? Are we going to get a return on it?" Nobody seemed to think. These people didn't seem to think about the implications of their decisions. I find that criminal negligence, actually, but it seems to be acceptable.
Yeah, what I'm finding strange is the inability for the questions to be. I mean, the polarization of society on either side of the fence has become extreme, and you can't actually ask genuine questions about policy without it becoming an emotional issue. Strangely enough, I've had that recently where I've said, well, if you don't like someone, well, tell me what policies they've done or haven't done, as opposed to how you feel about them. Very strange. I mean, hate to say it. Well, I mean, I said, I don't care about, I've had this recently about Trump. I said, I don't care about Trump. But why do you hate him so much? Do you know any of the policies he's done? Not one person in the UK has been able to answer that. And I find that the same over climate change. And it's interesting, mainstream media are pumping out it a lot this summer with all these heat waves that have been going on and last, so it's very strange where science should be questioning. We should be questioning all the information. And that seems to me very logical. Yet scientists are incredibly attached to their own thesis without allowing someone to say, well, actually, is that necessarily true?
Well, that's right. You demonstrated quite clearly with COVID. We weren't allowed to question. You saw Andrew Bridgen asking questions in the House, and that was probably as good an example as any. Those questions were valid. The fact that he mentioned the Holocaust in passing was probably not a very clever thing to do. But the fact he was, as you say, it's the questions. Deal with the questions, but they won't, because they don't want to answer the questions. In fact, you'll notice that there are quite a few MPs who said they're not going to stand in the next election, more than the average this time in the cycle. And one of the reasons I'm convinced is they know that the game's up. They don't want to be in the next Parliament and having to answer for what was done in this Parliament.
Yeah, I think. I mean, in my opinion, we need a group of engineers, because engineers do tend to have a very, I think people become very attached to their own science, their own view of what they're looking at, rather than actually questioning it. So Yeah, I think it's been brilliant talking to you. Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing us with with us, what you have to think about net zero. Um, I think the British people need to think a lot about what we need to do to create and look after our own resources and our own assets again, rather than being dependent on others. That's the starting
and
point.
and and their own people. Those people are being forced to have heat pumps that they can't afford. They're already in fuel poverty, a lot of them, and they're going to be driven into the ground. Once they've got electric vehicles, then they won't be able to travel so easily, as easily as they can now. It will restrict the way they operate, and we saw from lockdown that has psychological impact on people. Now, I think that's one of the worst aspects of this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great believer that the wealth creators of this country are the small medium enterprises, social enterprises, and that's what I call Middle England. Um, and they are the people who create the goods and services, albeit we're a net importer today. And
Yeah,
I think our politicians have lost sight of their role, and a lot of them don't come from industry now because they're basically career politicians. And
yeah, they've done PPEs. Yeah,
yeah,
politics,
or,
philosophy, economics,
yeah,
and
there are MBAs. And I shouldn't say what I want to say about MBAs, but MBAs. There's nothing better. I'm not even going to say it. There's nothing better than meeting men who've grown up in an industry on the shop floor and they smell it and know it. It's a bit like the NHS. If you're a porter, you'll know what's going on. And interestingly enough, I asked a nurse recently and she told me exactly what my views were of the NHS. And it's not anything to do with privatization, it's to do with all chiefs and no Indians and not the real people being the chiefs anymore. And the
yeah,
chiefs are,
yeah, yeah. I think that's right. One of the first things that I think needs to be addressed is, as well as I do, Mike, that if you've got high turnover rates, until you've resolved that, you're wasting your time because you keep throwing more and more good money after bad and trying to retrain new people. You've lost accountability because people keep disappearing and you have to keep replacing them. Now, that is no good to any business. So the first thing to do is address the reasons, and we know what the reasons are. Well, some of them, as you just mentioned, the fact we've got people who've got no sort of understanding. I've seen this personally. You must have seen it. You go to the local surgery, and you tell them we've got a problem. Can't sleep. I'm in pain. They say, "Oh, sorry, you're going to have to go at the bottom of the list. We've only got so many doctors." Yeah. The thing that really struck me with that was that they didn't even do what they used to call triage. They didn't say, "Oh, this man has got higher priority than somebody else." They just put him on a list. That's what you get when you get people with no knowledge, no medical knowledge, in charge of the process.
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing that across the board. I think we have a lack of. I mean, it's we talk about UK PLC. Well, it's time to change the management of UK PLC if they've been selling our assets and running off with the with the dividends.
These are our strategic assets we're talking about here. In the NHS is one. Obviously, the power industry is another. To have if we were building SMRs, we'd have some confidence, more confidence. But and in fact, if you look at the overall cost of wind turbines with all the energy storage and with all the extra transmission lengths, with the extra losses and the life cycle, costs, you will find that SMRs are no more expensive than wind turbines. But nobody will answer that question. They just carry on building wind turbines.
One fact that astonished me, and I think we had a conversation about this at one point, is that I remember growing up and we had lots of gas storage. Remember those cylinders everywhere? And now we have 3 days gas storage. Is that right? Or something like that?
Well, it was 3. They just opened up the Rough gas storage facility, they say. So we should have a bit more than that now. But even at 10 days, it's not going to be anywhere near enough, because if it happens, and we are now more dependent on LNG. LNG comes in tankers, and it's coming from places like the States or Middle East in tankers. And what happens is, when they saw that the demand was going up in Western Europe, because the Russian supplies were in decline, they realized that it was a great profit opportunity. So all those tankers diverted, and they started to go towards Western Europe. And that's what will happen again. We got no control over that.
So the stats were, what storage did we have in the 60s and 70s compared to now?
I don't have that figure, but you're quite right. We had all of those gasometers, they were called, and you can tell just by the fact they're no longer there, that it's been cut back.
It's been converted in London. One that King's Cross is converted into a residence. I think it's extraordinary, really. Roger, that's brilliant. I know time is passing on. Anything else that you want to add? Sometimes our sound didn't come out great, but I'll see if I can modify that, but never mind. But it's been brilliant to have you on. Really great to have another point of view from an engineer who sees things in a very straightforward, logical way. And anything you'd like to add before we close?
I don't think so. I mean, at a political level, the big challenge for people is who they're going to vote for. I think that Rishi Sunak has recently started to realise that he's suddenly become the friend of the motorist, and I just think that if people don't think a little bit beyond the horizon, they'll just end up saying, well, okay, he's given us a bit, we'll vote for him because we don't want Labour. That would be sad, because that doesn't resolve the underlying issues. The fact that things we've been talking about, the fact there's corruption, the fact that foreigners can have more influence on our parliament than our own people. That to me is got to be changed, and it won't be changed if everyone just votes for Rishi Sunak in the hope of avoiding Labour.
Well, I'm a great believer that it's the wealth creators that we have to turn to, and they're the people that employ 19 million people. They're the ordinary Britons, as I call them, and we're trying to the extraordinary in the ordinary. We have so many pundits and experts these days, and I've listened to them, and I listened to this nurse tell me what was wrong with the NHS. I've never heard anything so clear and simple, and very much aligned with my experiences and my views. We give too much power to apparent academia that is paid for by other people.
Yeah, and the other people who've got power, like the Mayor of London, they were supposed to serve the people, provide services to the residents. Instead, they're trying to dictate to residents what their behaviour should be. And some of those entrepreneurs that you're talking about, Mike, people like plumbers, they've got to get around London, but they can't now without spending more money. And we've got these LTNs, around places like Oxford, where people are now coming out onto the bypass to avoid the LTN charge, 15 minutes, cities. They're coming out, they're blocking up the bypass, and they're doing more miles to get back in somewhere else around the outside of the city. These people are, this is going to destroy the local economies, and these are the people we need to be able to go to move ahead.
I'm going to give you a little anecdotal story here. I had a coffee in Oxford 2 weeks ago. It cost me, and I wasn't sure if I'd gone in through the ULEZ or not, because there's no signage. And then so I tell you what it cost. It cost me £28 for parking, and I think it was £7 an hour on a meter. Then I walked. I wasn't sure if I'd been through one of these the central oulas, because the signage is apparently it's there, but you're never quite sure. So I had to write to them, say, have I been in? And he did write back, I have to say, and say, no, you haven't. But I mean, it's constantly, there's something at our core, we haven't got our core values right. It's like we're having things imposed from the top, and yet we're not producing goods or services from the bottom. It's incredible, and those hardworking people are constantly being penalised. So I tell you how much the coffee cost me: £50 in Oxford. That was for 2.5 stay, and I said to them, you know, you're a very expensive city, really, just to come and visit you.
And the other side of the equation is that because it's the same in Brighton, people don't go in as often as they used to. And so that means that the business tax income volumes must have fallen. So that means they need to find more sources of income, which means probably, and at some point, we will see a road tax, because all of the money that's collected at the moment on ICE vehicles, that's petrol and diesel, in fuel tax, will disappear if we all have EVs. So all those they've got to replace it with something, and it will probably be a road tax.
Yeah, no, I think I think that England is a fantastic place, and we have, and the Great Britain is an amazing place, but somehow we've lost sight of, governance has lost sight of who it's serving, and it's to serve the people. And I believe it comes from the ground up, not from the top down. So I have very simple views, being a Democrat, and all this stuff we have about conspiracy, non-conspiracy. It's the middle ground, the ordinary people of Britain who will either comply or will make changes in the end.
Yeah, you're right. They could be the engine of change.
Yeah. And I think that's it. Look, you've been brilliant. I have to say thank you so much for talking. I know our sound quality dipped in and out a little bit, so I'll see if I can modify that as we go down. But yeah, great to have you, and I'll speak to you shortly. All right. Yeah, before you go, let's just turn off. So say goodbye. Stay on. I'm going to end the recording. So cheers. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.